I'm Child Psychiatrist Clifford Sussman, MD. In this video series, I answer your questions about internet addiction and video game addiction. If you're missing any of the other parts from YouTube, you can go to my website, www.cliffordsussmanmd.com. What effect does video game and internet use have on the brain? Many parents think it's fine for their kids to use as many hours of technology as they wish, as long as they've done their homework. Well, here's a picture of the brain. Research has shown us that everything that gives us intense pleasure, from substances to video games, causes activation of a specific bundle of wires in our brain called the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. So we actually know the part of the brain that transmits pleasure. And here it is on this picture of the brain, the pleasure pathway of the brain, these blue lines. Let's zoom in for a close-up of these blue lines that look kind of like wires. On a cellular level, you can see that the big wires are actually made up of many little wires. And even one of these little wires is made up of individual cells, or brain cells, also called neurons. So these cells connect to each other to form these little wires. Now, this chain of neurons is similar to a real wire in that it can carry an electrical impulse in one direction. Each neuron communicates with the next neuron through a space called the synapse. So here I have the end of the presynaptic neuron, the neuron before the synapse, and the beginning of the postsynaptic neuron after the synapse. Now, the presynaptic neuron communicates with the postsynaptic neuron by releasing a substance into the synapse called a neurotransmitter. Dopamine is the key neurotransmitter involved in pleasure. Now, each little Pikachu that you see there in the presynaptic neuron represents a molecule of dopamine. And the man in the corner, he represents the person whose brain we're talking about. Dopamine gets released by the presynaptic neuron into the synapse. Then it gets taken in by the receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic neuron. So this is what's happening at baseline when our guy here is just feeling a typical everyday amount of pleasure. Now, what happens when he's playing video games or browsing the internet, and he starts to get that instant gratification that we talked about in the other videos? All of a sudden you have a huge release of dopamine into the synapse. So now he's getting a lot more pleasure, and you can see that the dopamine goes into the receptors, and well, you can see from his face that he's having a lot more pleasure. So this is him when he's just started to play his video games and he's having a really good time. But what happens when this process goes on for hours and hours and hours on end of all this dopamine being released into the cells while he's playing and playing and playing online? Eventually, the brain's going to get tired. I mean, how much pleasure can we take, and for how long? The brain's got to have some way of saving energy. I mean, it's just going to get worn out if it keeps taking in all this pleasure. Well, it turns out we do have a way to save energy. It's called downregulation, and that means that we're going to get rid of some of our dopamine receptors on the surface of the postsynaptic cell. And the longer this goes on for, the more downregulation you're going to see. So now you can see that there's fewer receptors than before, but because he's still online, because he's still playing video games, if you look at his face, he looks exactly the way he did before he started playing. So even though he's playing video games, he's getting the same amount of pleasure he was at baseline because there's fewer receptors to catch the dopamine. This is the state of prolonged use or tolerance, meaning that he now requires more dopamine to get the same amount of pleasure. This is a reason why people who play for hours and hours on end may not experience as much pleasure in their other everyday activities. Now, what happens if he suddenly stops using? Let's say he's been on his computer now for 10 hours on a Saturday, and his parents come up and tell him it's time to go to bed. And so they shut off the machine, and all of a sudden he has to stop, and all that dopamine goes away. But he still has fewer receptors for dopamine. So now he has less pleasure and less receptors for pleasure. And let's see what happens. This is called withdrawal. There's less dopamine, and less dopamine is being taken in. And this is his I'm in withdrawal phase. So this is that uncomfortable state of withdrawal that you'll see in people who use technology heavily when they're not using it. And it includes moodiness, irritability, and anxiety. Many parents who tried unsuccessfully to limit the digital technology use in their children are very familiar with those symptoms. Now you may be wondering, is this process reversible? Can I restore my brain to the way it was before I started excessively using internet and video games? The answer is yes. However, it can take 2 to 4 weeks for the brain to regenerate its receptors to dopamine through a process called upregulation. Therefore, in order to restore the brain to its previous sensitivity to stimulation and pleasure, you would have to discontinue whatever you were using, including internet and video games, for up to a month. This is what psychiatrists call detoxification. While this process may be challenging, for some people with addiction, it may actually be easier than trying to reduce the hours they use on a daily basis. In the next video in this series, I'm going to talk more about treatment. And if you need access to any of the other videos, please go to my website, www.cliffordsussmanmd.com. Please support this free form of psychoeducation by liking my video and subscribing to my channel.